Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to today's Reddit Quickie from the subreddit HFY, called The Roar. Written by Regal. The link to the original will be down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. He stood on the edge of the field, listening to the buzz. It sounded far off, subdued, but he knew that it was just a warm-up. Alcohol, narcotics, money, none of that would give him the same sort of feeling that he got to listening to the crowd. The game hadn't even begun yet, and he loved it. Just the sound of people moving into place, filling up the stadium. The others were all in their meditation chambers, trying to clear their minds to open up their spirits for the ritual. They didn't understand the human concept of getting pumped for the game. The Koltes were very fond of meditation, reflection, and all of that sort of thing. And why not? They were centuries ahead of everyone else in terms of tech. Everyone was reliant on their continued goodwill towards the lesser species. They'd always been rather mysterious and enigmatic. They didn't respond to many diplomatic requests, trade delegations, or declarations of war. They generally just politely but firmly told the younger species that they had no interest whatsoever and sent them on their way. No one had been able to enter the core worlds before. That is, until Victor. 3 years ago, he had been in another agri-colony farm kid, getting ready for an exciting life of farming dirt. He was good enough at baseball and football and the other football that he might have been able to get a chance at a scholarship to a decent school. But instead, 6 months before graduation, a Koltes ship crash-landed into the planet. It was some sort of prototype that had gone wrong. Even the gods made mistakes. Miraculously, only one person had been near enough for the impact site to get caught in the blast. Him. He'd been out on the perimeter that morning checking the fence when his world exploded. He lost both legs and his left arm, plus the general case of fractured and broken ribs, skull fracture, internal bleeding. Good stuff. To make matters worse, when everyone in the hospital said that he was lucky enough he didn't lose his right arm, he got to inform them that he was in fact a lefty. Coming from a family of dirt farmers, he was looking at living the rest of his life with a cheap prosthetics, fraction of the strength of a normal limb, no feeling and lots of phantom pain. Then the Koltes showed up. For the first time in history, or human history at least, they came to us. They apologized, gave his parents a massive sum of money, and only had one condition, that they could take Victor back with them, fix him up, and let him attend one of their schools to make amends. Well, what could he say? The ambassador was there, the press, he smiled, and he got propped up for some pictures, said goodbye to his folks and said that he'd return or call when he had a chance to get taken into the Koltes territory. The prosthetics were incredible, better than anything humans could make. It wasn't that they were stronger, or could shapeshift or anything like that. They just felt exactly like his real arm and legs had. It was like he never lost them. When he was doing physical therapy in rehab, they introduced him to the ancient Koltes sport to test his reflexes and coordination. Then it was like a mix between capture the flag, American football, and hunting. Most places just had the modular obstacle course and holographic targets, but real courses had small, engineered forests and real animals. What would happen if 2 teams would set out on either side of the forest or obstacle course, and then the animals would be released in the center of each side, and they captured some animals and tried to drag them back to their side, carry others into the other team's side, and just flat out try not to get stomped on by the rest of the animals, or the opposing team. When they'd first explained it to him, he was really confused, but he noticed that they seemed really peaceful. Koltes got really worked up just by talking about it. They said that he shouldn't feel bad that he wasn't very good at the game, since in general humans had worse eyesight, less strength, and less speed than Koltes. Then, to everyone's surprise including his own, he was amazing at it. First, they'd assumed that it was a fluke, and he was competing against the Koltes undergoing physical therapy after all. So they set him up for the equivalent of a high school team. He crushed them. Then they moved him to the equivalent of a college team. After all, they'd offer to each team. For the first time in his life, he had an important people fighting over him. He got sent to the Koltes capital for all the places, and was enrolled in some fancy school. The coursework that they originally gave him was so far beyond his level that it wasn't even funny. So they quickly found the easiest classes possible for him and told him not to worry about academics. His first year, he led the team through an undefeated season. They quickly gave him an honorary degree and got him signed to the Praetorians. Despite the name, the team was the worst in the professional Venner League. Just being signed to any sort of professional team was in itself amazing, however. No other species had ever been offered the position. So, his first professional year in Venner and his second year in the Koltes, he carried them into a staggering 96 wins to 84 loss season. Made more impressive considering that they'd been 40 to 140 the previous season. He felt that they'd have done better, but they insisted that he rested and sat out every other game. The Koltes players only played one game in 3 themselves. It was a hard, dangerous game. His right arm got broken 3 times in that season. So when the season was over, they offered him a much larger contract, and he turned it down, insisting that they use the money to buy better players. Then he tried to have them replace his right arm with a prosthetic, but voluntary amputation wasn't a concept that the Koltes understood. So he took an axe to it in front of the Koltes hospital and let them clean it up and give him a new replacement arm like he wanted to in the first place. They thought that he was insane. Maybe he was, but this season he hadn't rested for a single game, and the Praetorians had gone undefeated. After sweeping both opposing teams in the postseason, they'd faced off against the Royal Guard, long considered the greatest team in the history of the sport. They had the most funding, the largest base, and more Hall of Fame players, and more Grand Championships than any other team. And they'd made it clear that they were not interested in letting some impetuous little human win the Grand Championship. That promise had come 3 games ago, and the Praetorians, under Victor's guidance, had won every single game. This was what it came down to. One more win meant a completely undefeated regular and postseason. It meant, for the first time in history, a non-Koltes would be in the winning team. He'd already been the first human on a professional team, so this was just another record to beat. Plus, for the first time in the history of any professional team that had gone completely undefeated, it would be broadcast to the entirety of the Koltes nation. 92% viewership, 28 billion people. And it wasn't a broadcast anywhere else. There wasn't a single human in the crowds out there. It was all Koltes, and he knew that they were cheering for him. When he had first left home, he'd expected to be homesick immediately. But instead he'd been focused on recovery, and then he'd started winning. He'd seen a pro baseball game back at home once. Farm league pros. And the energy of that game had been incredible to him. The cheering, the noise, the pure sensation that it brought. But to be on the field, to hear the crowds cheering at you, it was better than anything else he knew. Nothing came close. He wasn't a drinker, the Koltes didn't even have narcotics for humans, and he wasn't brave enough to try screwing one of the women because he lacked the hard scales on the belly. So her quills would tear him up. All he had was winning. The other players needed to meditate to clear their minds, to try and reach some sort of clarity and spirit like they said that they could focus on the game. And push out of the way the noise of the crowd. That was all a distraction to them. But Vincent fed off of it. He ate it up and asked for more. He didn't do any kind of showboating because there was no room for it in the sport. He just won. Over and over and over. He might lose 4 or 5 arms and legs per game and just snap the replacements on and went back out. He never stopped. So when he heard that murmur of the crowd, he closed his eyes, imagining what it would sound like when the game was actually going. The rest of the team could sit in their quiet little chambers and meditate. He wanted to hear the crowd. Victor He turned back and saw the team's manager. He saw the old Koltes, coals grey, and his scales were worn-looking. He didn't use artificial polisher like some of the older Koltes did. They've given your request the all-clear. It's waiting for you. Victor just grinned and followed the Koltes into what had been set aside as a meditation chamber, though he never used it. Instead of soothing paintings or Zen garden or anything like that, it was a massive bell waiting inside. They've hooked it up to the PA system. Press that red button over there to start ringing. The music will begin. I must admit that it is interesting to use music like this. Do humans often incorporate music with sport? All the time, Victor nodded, and then rubbed his hands together as he looked at the bell. Might want to get out of here. This will be loud, he said before the manager nodded and left the room. Then Victor pulled up the headphones that they had left behind and pressed the button on the wall and picked up a hammer. He took a slow breath and then slammed the hammer onto the bell. It reverberated and rang through the small room, which was picked up by the speakers. He could imagine the crowds now growing quiet and confused as he kept ringing the bell. It wasn't some light little thing just to make a noise. It was heavy and deep, and it was the sort of bells that only rang at funerals. As he kept ringing the bell, he finally heard the starting of a guitar, then the bass, and then the drums came in, the heavy beat matching the tempo of the bell perfectly. Finally, he heard in his headphones, "Victor, it's time." He left the meditation room, and the others were lined up just in front of the entrance to the field as he heard the music outside. But the crowd was quiet. Then there was an announcer. "And now, welcome home your team, the Praetorians." The rest of the team began to jog out onto the field as the cheers began. Victor waited for a moment as the lyrics of the song progressed, and then he jumped onto the field and hit it on cue. "I got my bell, and I'm gonna take you to hell. I'm gonna get you, Satan, get you. Hell's bells." The roar of the crowd erupted then. He could feel the energy instantly. He could feel the cheering and hollering. He could see them on their feet and all around the stadium as he held up his arms. "What's the plan, Victor?" Garnesh asked as he joined the team on the field as they began to run towards the side of the field. "Half of you on defense, the rest on herding." "What? No striking?" Discush asked, clearly surprised. "I'll be our striker. We're up 3 games, guys. They know they have to stop us here and now. They'll be pushing their own strikers very hard. Counter it. We can't afford to let this drag on. They've injured 8 of our players. Any more of you go down, we might have to play short on the team. We win today. No doubts, no fear. Victory." "I don't know how you know how to make your spirit and soul so clear and focused," Kagan asked with a shake of his head. Victor just laughed. He didn't need meditation to know that he wanted to win. Every fiber of his being and his body needed to win. But with the crowd cheering him on, he was fricking invincible. He was 8 feet tall. He was mean as hell. And this was his day. No. This was humanity's day, even if the nearest human was light years away. He had no idea what was going on right now, and he vowed to win in the name of humanity. The cultists would cheer, and they would roar for him, for humanity. They were approaching the center of the field and the forest and waited for them. Well, the incredibly well-crafted obstacle course that was used for real trees and rocks and a stream to make it interesting. The open field that they were in had 3 sections to it. On either side, there were pens that used to herd animals into. In the center was essentially a stone well that they tossed striker animals into. Back in the day, cultists celebrated games by slaughtering the animals in the pens and letting the creatures in the well drown. These days, the herded animals had very cushy lives outside of the games, and the well would lower the animal into the care of a veterinarian waiting in a special room below it. But, to be honest, Victor wasn't sure that he'd want to win any less bad if he had to slaughter the animals by hand. His desire to win was great, and it amused the cultists greatly that a direct translation of his name was meant winner. Finally, they heard the horn being blown, and the signal to start the game of the Kiwa birds screeched as they flew up out of the forest in the center. The roar of the crowd got a bit intense for a moment, and the cultists around him either shifted into more defensive positions or picked up the pace. Victor wasn't as fast as any of them and quickly fell behind. However, he did catch up again, and they entered the forest. The cultists were careful, and sometimes paranoid creatures, always wary of an ambush or trap. They could also see very well, so there were times when the teams would spend 15 or 20 minutes planning out ways to trap the enemy team inside the forest, each making moves to counter moves from across the course. Victor didn't do that. He saw just fine by human standards, but in the thick of the forest that meant that he couldn't see about 10 feet in front of him at any given time, which meant that he planned 10 feet ahead. He knew where he wanted to go, however, so he just burst through the bushes and past the trees towards the mountain. It wasn't really a mountain, more of a hill on top of a forest where the stream started. It was there where most of the valuable strikers' animals rested, guarded by a very carefully bred and extremely angry crag snapper. Strikers were working teams to distract it and grab the smaller animals to hide near the beast. But that took time, and usually meant the strikers wouldn't try it till later in the game when they knew that no other choice was to be had. Not today. Victor kept up a jog, and he ignored the stealth and just kept moving forward. There might be some cultists from the opposing team watching him and lalling about his very elaborate and well-planned trap, but right now, Victor would never know it. Take it as it came, forge ahead. That's how he kept winning. As he reached the start of the mountain, the trees gave way to rocks, and he had to start moving up the rocky opening with the little stream trickling down the center. He was hopping over it and building speed as he hopped from rock to rock, starting to move recklessly fast in what was a dangerous area of the field. He could see the top of the path even out before he got up to it and reached up with his left hand and disconnected his right arm at the shoulder. Pulling it free with a pop, he then screamed at the top of his lungs and raised his prosthetic arm in the air by the wrist and sprinted the last few feet over the edge and into the opening beyond. Just what he had expected, there was a shallow pond with a whole variety of colorful and exotic creatures around the edges. In the center was a crag snapper. It was essentially an elephant-sized gator with a turtle shell and an incredibly mean disposition. It started to rise up from the deeper part of the pond, drawn by Victor's scream as it turned, mouth opening to reveal a massive rows of sharp teeth. But Victor jumped into the air, slamming his prosthetic arm down onto the creature's head so hard the entire thing cracked and then broke apart, shattering over the snapping skull. The creatures rocked back, stunned, as Victor used the open maw to springboard and jump up into the creature's back. He ran along it and spotted the loose portion of the shell that he knew would be there. Quickly kneeling down on the now rocking creature's shell, he flipped the section of the shell up with his remaining hand. Inside was a very surprised Gipset, a sort of fox-eared ferret with fur like a sable. Or so he had been told. He grabbed the creature before it could scamper off, and then roughly stuffed it down in the front of his own shirt, tugging on the string that he had fastened to it to pull it tight. It made breathing a bit hard, but it was the easiest way that he could hold on to the critter. At least, the fur was incredibly soft against his chest. Ah! The teeth, however, were a lot less soft, but it would stop after a little. He began to run down the shell of the crag snapper now, seeing the exit from the area heading into the opposite team's territory. He quickly started moving down it as he heard the crag snapper behind him howl in range, and he started to move forward. The rest of the creatures in the area began to move quickly to get out of its way. Soon enough they were brushing past Victor as they got out of the way of the rampaging snapper. The enclosure was made to keep him stuck up in the mountain, but Victor could hear the shaking and crunching behind him as the creature tried to smash its way through the rock. At the very least, the rest of the animals in the forest were now on high alert. Victor was back down in the forest running for the territory of the enemy team when he burst through the bush and then fell forward as something snagged his left foot. He barely caught himself before hitting the ground and narrowly avoided crushing the gispet in his shirt. He had to practice doing things one-handed to make sure that he was still effective while missing an arm. He turned over and looked back as he saw his foot snagged on a very intricate rope of some sort. The knot itself he recognized as the sort that you need 2 hands to loosen up. Frick! This is the end, human! Victor looked around for a moment and then saw the Koltes shake the dirt and foliage off of his quills as he got up. We will break you here. You won't win. We can't allow it. You were never meant to get this far. Tell that to my fans, Victor spat back. Even in the dense forest, they could hear the cheering crowd in the stadium all around them. There were hidden cameras spread around to let them watch. They were obviously enjoying his progress so far. The fans know nothing, the Xena growled, and swiped at the air. You will not endanger our prestige. Your team loses here. We've kept you from winning for 52 years. This will be no different. Look at you, one-armed and without a creature. What was your plan anyway? Victor realized that the creature didn't know that he had a gispit in his shirt. Just making trouble. You hear that screaming? I angered the crag snapper. It's trying to break out of the mountain. You didn't. Oh, I did. The Koltes looked up at him and then back towards the mountain. He knew as well as Victor that his team would need help trying to herd animals through the path of an angry snapper. This isn't over. Your leg is caught. You go nowhere. The Xena growled and turned, sprinting towards the sound of the crag snapper, smashing apart the crafted mountain. Vincent tugged on the snare, but it wasn't strong enough to pull it apart one-handed. He couldn't just pop off his leg either. How the hell would he get to the enemy well? He looked around and then he grabbed a nearby rock, wincing a bit as he prepared himself to start slamming the rock down against his prosthetic foot. He was soon gasping and crying in pain as he did so. The rules allowed for his fake limbs because they weren't any stronger than he would have had if they were real. But so long as they were connected, they'd feel pain just like a normal limb. Normally, he could just disconnect the thing and be done with it, but this time, he kept smashing the foot, hearing it crack and splinter, before it was broken enough for him to pull the stump of his ankle free. Grabbing the nearby tree and pushing himself up, and testing the weight on the stump before screaming in white-hot agony. Reaching up and snapping off a branch of a tree, testing it out as a very crappy but functional crutch. Then he leaned a bit and started hopping. He could push off the stump a bit and grit his teeth, ignoring the pain as he moved. When he got to the edge of the forest, he saw an empty field. They'd sent everyone into the forest, no defenders. He laughed and he kept hopping forward. Then he heard the crowd roar as they saw him emerge. Victor! Victor! He grinned and tried to move faster then. He was about halfway into the well when he heard the scream of anger behind him. The Koltes had come back, obviously knowing something was up when he heard the chant. Damn! Victor tried hobbling forward faster. The Koltes was sprinting as hard as he could towards him from behind. He could hear the chanting of the crowd and finally he tossed the branch behind him, putting more weight on his stump and screaming in agony with every step. But also every step brought him closer. With one hand, there was no way that he could get the gispit and toss it to the well. Not with the Koltes so close behind him. He moved closer and closer. Victor! 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 He was so freaking close. He heard the footsteps behind him. He could hear the Koltes' ragged breathing. Victor! They were chanting his name, stomping their feet. 100,000 people were here in the stadium. 28 billion were watching live. Victor! He was screaming non-stop now that he'd moved forward. He was at the edge of the well and didn't know what to do. Still, he tumbled forward, nearly cracking his skull on the far side as his knees slammed into the side of the well and he began to tumble in. Just when he thought that he was in and the points would be his, he stopped. He looked up and saw the Koltes clutching his intact right leg. No, no! Victor reached up with his remaining hand and popped the release in his thigh. No! The Koltes screamed in dismay as Victor continued to fall into the well. He didn't know what would happen. The animals would fall gently into the veterinarian facility to be cared for in case they were injured during the game. But the heaviest that they weighed was like 10 kilograms. Victor might literally be too heavy just to plummet to his death here. He felt something pluck his face and his hand trying to stop his fall, pressing on his cheek. Then there were others. But he was still moving quickly as he fell through the fake bottom of the well and got flipped around so that his back was at a padded area with a heavy thud. He lay there for a few moments and then he finally spoke. Ow! A team of Koltes rushed into the padded area then, pulling off of his shirt and pulling out the gispet. The creature looked surprised but not harmed. Then the Xenos glanced once more and another and then back down at Victor, who had started laughing before groaning. He definitely fractured some ribs in that fall. What happens now? He finally asked. You're out of the game, one said. Did the gispet points count? He looked around, obviously confused at the surprised faces. We don't know. The rules must be checked. Well then, get me a wheelchair and a new pair of legs and another arm, and get me topside. I have to cheer my team on. What? But you're out of the game. I can't compete, but I can cheer. I can roar. You hear the crowd. They're shouting victory. Victory. They want us to win. Get me up there. So long as he had breath in his lungs, he'd urge his team on. By playing or by roaring, soon enough, his voice was amongst the many in the crowd, cheering as loud as they could while they watched. Before, the roar was for him. It might be again, but now the roar was for his team. End of story. And that, my friends, is the end of this Reddit Quickie. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel or the author, all the stuff is down below. And as always, I hope that you guys have a good one, and I'll see you in the next story. Cheers.